All right, welcome. Welcome to the kickoff of a new season of Primetime at the Bethel University Library. The Friends of the Bethel University Library collaborates with faculty development and other offices on campus to bring you programming that celebrates learning in and beyond the classroom of Bethel faculty, students, and staff. We're so glad you joined us. Join us on Thursday, September 23rd at 11:15 for a presentation by Faculty Excellence for Scholarship winner, Dr. Julie Hogan, who will share about the future of new physics that might help answer our questions about the structure of the universe. Today, we welcome Dr. Chris Gehrz, Professor of History, and celebrate the publication of his new book, Charles Lindbergh, A Religious Biography of America's Most Infamous Pilot. Many of us are amazed by Chris's writing, by the fact that it is of such high quality and depth, but also because he manages to churn it out at such a prodigious rate. He contributes frequently to a number of blogs, including his own blog called The Pietist Schoolman. He is an expert on pietism, the tradition of Protestant Christianity that Bethel claims as its own, and he is an author and editor of a number of books on that subject. He's also the go-to expert in Bethel's history, being willing to give presentations on that subject at the drop of a hat. And now he has produced a widely praised book on Charles Lindbergh. He has not quite reached the level of St. Thomas Aquinas, who wrote by dictating to scribes and in that way would write as many as 4 different works at the same time, but perhaps he is our Bethel equivalent. Let's welcome Chris.
I guess I should say thanks, Ray, for that. I'm not sure introducing someone by comparing them to St. Thomas is exactly fair. For that matter, being compared to Julie Hogan doesn't seem fair either. I'm not really going to get at the basic structures of the universe in this talk. I'm just going to talk about one human particularly. It's good to be back here. I've been here many times, but not since before COVID. I'm going to leave the mask on. Unfortunately, I was exposed to someone with a positive test, and I have not yet been able to go over to health services and get a test, but I'm vaccinated, I'm fine, but just for safety's sake, I'll leave this on. Hopefully you can hear me. All right, thank you for coming. Thank you, those of you, whoever is out there on Zoom, whether it's 0 or 20 of you, thanks for joining us. I just realized I forgot my notes in my office. We will wing this talk, but this is how I normally lecture, so maybe it'll be better that way. I don't actually know. So where do I want to start here? There are a lot of things to be said about Charles Lindbergh, and so I'll start with this. Right after this class, I teach modern Europe. So I'll be talking about Napoleon Bonaparte later. So this is my day for biographies of difficult, controversial men, I guess. And one thing I've talked about the first 2 weeks is how historians use timelines as a way to represent complicated pasts. I mean, in the same way that cartographers create maps that help us see at least some facet of the world, historians use timelines as a way to kind of summarize some facet. And you can do this with a life, right? And so I actually want to kind of give you 3 timelines today, one very familiar, one that's more central to my book, and then the one that I actually want to talk about, which is about education. Because as I wrote this book and then read it again this summer, I thought maybe there's something here that we should talk about early on in the semester at Bethel University. So here's the first most familiar timeline. This is kind of the highs and lows public Lindbergh timeline. If you know anything about him, at least a few of these events might be familiar. So you might know that he was born in 1902 in Detroit, actually, his mother's hometown, but then lived mostly in Little Falls, Minnesota. My interest in this whole project started when I took my kids to the Lindbergh house in Little Falls, which is just past St. Cloud on Highway 10. And here's Lindbergh at age 69, 3 years before his death, visiting that house. So I got to sit in that seat and look at the books in that library. That's actually part of one of the chapters in the book. I grew up in Minnesota and then finally comes to public attention in May of 1927 when he flies 33.5 hours by himself across the Atlantic Ocean from Long Island to Le Bourget Field. Outside Paris, 150,000 people crowd around the plane, and one of them is an American editor, a friend of Ernest Hemingway's named Harry Crosby, who says this is the new Christ, and the spirit of St. Louis is the new cross. And that hits at the second timeline we're going to get at, which is the religious theme here. From there, he becomes such a famous celebrity, he manages to marry the daughter of an American diplomat, Anne Morrow. And 3 years later, enters American celebrity for a very different, more tragic reason. Their child, Charles Jr., not yet 2 years old, is kidnapped and murdered. It becomes the crime of the century, at least to that point. A couple years later, a kidnapping trial, which I don't spend a lot of time on, but there are many, many other books on that if you're really interested in conspiracy theories about that. Press scrutiny is so bad for the Lindberghs that basically at the very, very end of 1936, they suddenly flee. And they get on a steamer, go to Liverpool, and live in England for a few years, and then France for about a year. And they live in exile simply to try to have some privacy and to try to raise their children and avoid another tragedy. While there, Lindbergh is asked to observe the air power of different European powers. He travels to the Soviet Union once, he travels to Germany three times, and he reports for the US government, and it draws him into debates about the origins of World War II. He comes back in 1939 to speak out against American intervention in that war. And in 1941, his most infamous speech, not far from here in Des Moines, Iowa, in September of that year, is reviled. He alleges that not just the British, not just FDR, but the Jews are trying to suck Americans into a war they shouldn't be fighting. He says you can't blame the Jews for not liking Nazi Germany, but they have their interests and Americans have ours, in so many words. And a few months later, Pearl Harbor, America First shuts down, and Lindbergh again disappears from sight largely. He makes a comeback though in 1953. He publishes a memoir of his 1927 flight that's called The Spirit of St. Louis. And it's so well written that it earns the Pulitzer a year later and becomes a film starring Jimmy Stewart, directed by Billy Wilder, that I write about. And in his last 20 years of life, Lindbergh has yet another chapter. He becomes most famous in his very last couple of decades as an environmental conservationist, advocating for the protection of endangered species. He helps create Voyageurs National Park up in northern Minnesota. He travels the world on behalf of the World Wildlife Fund, and specifically advocates for people that he calls primitive, people who live in places like Pacific Islands and East Africa. And he buys a home in Hawaii and dies there of lymphoma in August of 1974. At age 72. So that's the public Lindbergh, and he's still a controversial figure. I kind of wanted to add to this timeline, 2021, this past summer, the city of Milwaukee renamed a park that had been named for Lindbergh, and they named it after a civil rights activist for reasons that might become more clear as we go along. I think Hopkins, Minnesota is in the middle of debating whether to rename its Lindbergh Gymnasium. Of course, not too many years ago, the Lindbergh Airport was renamed Terminal 1 for Minneapolis, St. Paul. So a famous figure, a controversial figure. I wasn't really as interested in some of this. The reason Charles Lindbergh came to my attention was for a part of his life that I think hardly anyone knows about, which is that Charles Lindbergh distrusted organized religion, but increasingly was very spiritual over his life. And there's a library of religious and spiritual biographies published by Ertmans out of Grand Rapids, Michigan, that increasingly is trying to tell non-traditional religious stories. A couple years ago, for example, D.G. Hart published a study of H.L. Mencken, a famously skeptical journalist who covered the Scopes trial. And so I thought this would be an interesting kind of spiritual but not religious biography. And so in my book, you might find a different kind of timeline. You find all of these, but you'll also find events like this. One summer when he was 6 years old, Charles Lindbergh said, his parents dragged him to First Congregational Church in Little Falls, Minnesota, and he hated it, just despised church. It was tedious and boring. It was hot and uncomfortable. He wanted to go swimming in the Mississippi or hunting or walking through the woods. And it was confusing and disinteresting anyway. And at least as he looked back, he said, that was my exposure to religion early on. His parents didn't make him go to church very often. They themselves were fairly skeptical. They believed in God, but God was to be found in nature, right? And the Bible was untrustworthy. That was his religious upbringing. But about 30 years later, in the middle of his sojourn in Europe, he and Anne take a long flight to India, where they're invited to attend a world religions parliament in honor of a Hindu mystic. You can actually find the record of this, and Colonel Charles A. Lindbergh and his wife are listed among there. Lindbergh didn't think a whole lot of the speakers, but he was very interested in specifically Eastern religions at that point, in supernatural phenomena like hypnosis. And generally, he was becoming more fascinated in what lies beyond the explanations of science, and what lies beyond this world, and even in immortality itself. 7 years later, in the middle of World War II, this you might know, but you might still not. Charles Lindbergh flew 50 combat missions in the South Pacific, shooting down one Japanese plane and bombing Japanese positions at age 42. He was only allowed to take one book with, he says, and he went to a bookstore in New York and bought the New Testament, which he had started to read for the first time a couple of years before. He said he would never have picked that a few years before, but now it's the most important book to him. A few years after that, he published a short book that I'll get into later, in which he quotes Jesus, specifically the Gospel of Matthew, which is his favorite gospel. In 1961, he visits a religious movement in Switzerland called Moral Rearmament. He doesn't like it very much. Glenn Close grew up in that and famously called it a cult, and Lindbergh probably would have agreed with her. But while he's there, he meets a delegate from Kenya, a Maasai tribesman, who starts talking to him about God in very different terms than Christians would. The following year, Lindbergh visits the Maasai for the first of many trips to East Africa, and this helps turn him towards either pantheism or panentheism. He's a little fuzzy in his terms, but he has some sense that God is not the God that the theists describe, distant and personal. God is to be found everywhere, or everything is to be found in God, or something like that. And this is what he spends most of the last 10, 12 years of his life writing about, actually. If you read his posthumous autobiography of values, a lot of it is about metaphysics, theology, spirituality, and it ends with a visit to Mount Kilimanjaro, where Lindbergh imagines dying and his essence being reabsorbed into what he called the life stream, along with the grasses and the lions and everything else that's alive. And so in the end, 5 years into this, I kind of thought this was a good choice for a non-traditional biography. So this is how I described it in the introduction to the book. All my quotations from my own book are from pages like 3 to 6. So it's a very traditional kind of presentation. You're going to wonder if I actually read the rest of the book. But at least pages 3 to 6 are great. So I'm going to quote them. Charles Lindbergh, I wrote, is a particularly good subject for a spiritual but not religious biography at this point in the 21st century. The child of a mother who questioned the veracity of the Bible and a father who found God in nature is much in common with the increasing share of what are called nuns, religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, who grew up with no church background. People had no particular childhood religion to renounce, but followed their own path to an adult spirituality. This is why I wrote the book. I wanted to better understand the nuns, the spiritual but not religious, which by varying estimates now are 25 to 35% of the American population, and among those 18 to 30, probably something over 40% at this point. It struck me on sabbatical in 2016, this is my family, this is my neighbors, this is probably my congregation to some extent, this is probably some of my students. I shouldn't assume that they have the same religious background that I do, or that they want the same kind of religious sort of ethos that I have. This is not atheism, it's not even agnosticism. Most of the SBNR, the religious nuns, believe in something beyond, right? They believe in divinity, they believe in the supernatural, they just don't think it should be confined to one religion's dogma. And so I thought it might be helpful to tell a story of a famous American who came to similar conclusions in a different context, if only to help me and other readers, especially other Christians, understand those people. Right? This is a missions field, right, for the church. And these are our neighbors who we should love as much as Muslims and Jews and Buddhists. So that's the second timeline. And this is mostly what you'll get if you do pick up this book, available for purchase from my office for $25. It beats Amazon, and I'll sign it if you want to come up later. But I thought I'd be a little mercenary to actually bring a stack of books to the talk, but you can find me, you know where to get a copy. But then as I prepared for this talk, it struck me that there's a kind of theme buried in the book that I maybe could pull out, a thread that might be especially important for us to think about here as we start a new year at Bethel University. And that's the education of Charles Lindbergh, which I think is part of this spiritual but not religious story and helps explain a lot of what I've already talked about and some of the really troubling complications that I've only hinted at so far. But I thought as a professor or as an educator and for the students here, like there are aspects of Lindbergh's educational experience that I think echo things we should be thinking about or suggest themes we should be thinking about as we start on this new educational project, New Year's educational project together. So I want to do another timeline. I want to give you 3 vignettes from 3 different years, kind of in the middle of Charles Lindbergh's life. And each of them, I want you to imagine that you're an educator at a college or university. So first of all, imagine that it is 1920, that fall, is the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And you can imagine that you're an English professor like Dan, or you can be a math professor. I don't know if we have any of them here, but an accounting professor like Bruce. Because Charles Lindbergh showed up at UW-Madison and failed both of those subjects in 1920. He was a terrible English student, but he was also a terrible math student, even though he ostensibly was there to major in mechanical engineering. He was really good at shooting, though. And so he was a star on the local ROTC shooting team because he had spent his whole childhood outdoors hunting with his father, like many kids in Little Falls would have at this time period. I'm gonna go ahead and close this. And he was pretty open about this. In 1927, after his flight, he rushed out a very quick memoir. And it actually doesn't say there's like 14 lines about his upbringing. So he's pretty cagey about this, but he goes ahead and he admits, the long hours of study at college were very trying for me. I had spent most of my life outdoors and never before found it necessary to spend more than a part of my time in study. So why do I mention this? So I teach a lot of first-year classes, and I think a lot of you do too. I think it's very easy to make assumptions about the faces we see early on, that we know where they come from, and we know why they're here, and we know what their preparation is like. Now, the first thing to say here is Charles Lindbergh is very unusual for his time. We live in an age and work at a college where we just assume a transition from graduating high school into college. Not all Americans do this, but a significant share do, and those of the middle and upper middle classes, we take it for granted people show up to college. And so my assumption that I have to guard against is a lot of our students are just here almost out of custom at this point. They're just here because it's a social expectation. They haven't yet really figured out what it means to be a college student. That's an assumption I have to guard against. That's not true of Charles Lindbergh. The fact that he is a high school graduate going to college in 1920 is very unusual. According to US Department of Education statistics, the average median American in 1920, here's where I'm going without notes, so take this with a grain of salt. The median American in 1920 had 8 years of schooling. Charles Lindbergh was one of all 18-year-olds, about 1 in 6 graduated high school in 1918 when Lindbergh graduated high school. And of all 18 to 24-year-olds in 1920, less than 5% of them attended college. So the assumption I would have made about Charles Lindbergh is this is a child of privilege, right? This is someone who's had unusual opportunities in his life. After all, he's the son of a congressman, and his mother was a teacher, right? With a degree in chemistry from Michigan at a time when very few women would have had a college degree. This is someone who's had all sorts of educational advantages. And so I see his first English paper or his first math exam, and I think something is wrong with him. He is lazy. He is not trying hard. I would probably incline in my judgmental, pietistic kind of self towards some kind of explanation like that, right? Here's what his mother told reporters in 1927. He was not hard to teach. Remember, she's a teacher. She'd actually gone back to teaching when he went to college. She joined him in Madison. Just think about that mother-son dynamic for a second. But I must confess, did not study hard on things which did not interest him. Now, as you'll see in a subsequent quotation, Lindbergh accepted this. He tended to work harder when he was interested, and that's a lesson I want to come back to in a second. He's also being thrown under the bus by his own mother just a little bit here. The main reason Charles Lindbergh was unprepared for college is that by the time he started his schooling, his parents were estranged. They didn't get divorced because his dad was a politician, and divorced politicians in Little Falls, Minnesota did not get reelected in 1908. But they lived separate lives. And so Charles Lindbergh's upbringing was spent in transit. Part of the year in Little Falls, part of the year in Washington with his dad, and then in Detroit, back and forth visiting his maternal grandparents. Right? He had over a dozen schools that he attended, and he would change mid-year every single year. Right? I mean, this is not a stable kind of educational preparation. He didn't even graduate high school in academic terms. He only graduated because it was World War I. The draft was getting farmers out of the workforce. And so the principal of Little Falls High School said that if you go and farm, you can graduate. Right? That's how he finished high school. This is what the adults in his life had done for him to prepare him to study mechanical engineering at UW-Madison in 1920. So I've entered this year trying not to make assumptions about why our students are here, what their socioeconomic position says about them, and what their preparation is. And instead, I've tried to take on as a challenge to try to notice people, which is hard. Like, I mean, it's hard with 140 students in CWC, but I've got 17 students at Night 25 this Thursday when we talk about Greek philosophy. I take it as a challenge to try to notice someone who maybe didn't do well in the first quiz and try to think about what is catching their attention or what is confusing them and how do I respond to that? Because I think that's actually something that's going to later be a big part of Charles Lindbergh's life. I thought about it this summer. I was kind of belatedly listening to the audiobook version of Educated, a memoir that came out about 3 years ago from Tara Westover. So if you've read this book, you know that's a really remarkable story. Tara Westover grows up in rural Idaho in a fundamentalist Mormon family of survivalists. Her father does not let her attend school, but inspired by an older brother, she begins to study for the ACT and dreams of going to Brigham Young University, and miraculously, she does so well in the ACT, she gets a scholarship to go off to BYU. And while she's there, she struggles. She has no background. She has never been to school her whole life. She's barely read anything apart from ACT prep work. And she's supposed to suddenly take art history classes and English classes and math classes. But part of what makes a difference in her life is that a professor, a European historian named Dr. Carey, I think it's Paul Carey, who's a dean now at BYU, he does European intellectual history, notices her, realizes there's something there, and actually invites her to go to Cambridge for a semester to study in this ancient university. And she writes at one point in the book while she's there that she feels like a fraud. She feels like she does not belong. She walks out of the meal at high table because she does not fit in. And she feels like everyone knows this. And he says in her recounting of this, he says this to her: "You are not fool's gold, shining only under a particular light. Whomever you become, whatever you make yourself into, that is who you always were. It was always in you, not in Cambridge, in you. You are gold. And returning to BYU, or even to that mountain you came from, will not change who you are. It may change how others see you. It may even change how you see yourself. Even gold appears dull in some lighting. But that is the illusion. It always was." And she describes this as a kind of turning point. And she goes on to get her PhD from Cambridge. She's now a fellow at Harvard. It's a remarkable story on all sorts of counts. I thought about that because this didn't happen for Charles Lindbergh, right? No one noticed him. He just fell through the cracks in 1920, and by 1922 had flunked out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And by all accounts, we should never have heard of him again, right? There's no reason that should have gone anywhere. It's just history takes a turn. There is gold shining, right? It just takes someone to notice it and to invest in that person and to challenge them and push them, but also to open doors for them, right? And that's a big part of what we're here to do. And there's no pattern for that. Our students don't come from a type, they're individuals. And it takes a lot of work on our part and energy and commitment to do that. And it's yet one more thing pulling at our time and attention, but I think it's something that's important in a place like this. We're smaller than BYU, right? If a BYU professor can do it, I think we can do it for our version of Charles Lindbergh or Tara Westover. While I'm here, the other thing I'll say though is Charles Lindbergh, as he thought back on his time at the University of Wisconsin, but also in high school and earlier, he does emerge with a kind of critique of formal education. And it's not a critique I'm especially sympathetic to, but it's how he explained part of what was going on. It's at least worth us nodding to before we move on to the next part of our story. So this is when he's starting to sketch his autobiography in the 1950s. "Year after year, we shape our youth at school bench and desk. Eyes travel endlessly over carbon lines of print, while ears transmit the droning sounds of tongues imparting knowledge. From school, youth graduates to an adult life that tries increasingly each year to screen off qualities of God and nature with a synthesized environment which uses knowledge, luxury, and comfort to pander the vanity of mind and anesthetize rebellious senses." And I think this is a familiar critique most of us have heard. You know, we are part of a system. We're putting another brick in the wall, right? We're just creating conformists. We are anesthetizing the senses. And I think that's a challenge we always are wary of. And by the time you get to this, you'll see that I think there's something valuable about the form, about the routines, about the structure of this place, but there is a danger to what we're doing. When I lecture, when I assign students readings, some of them are going to respond like this. And they might not take the later turn Charles Lindbergh did take. So I try to take this seriously, even as I want to argue with him about this. In 1966, near the end of his life, Charles Lindbergh entered a new kind of habit that's quite strange but useful for me. He started reading all the biographies written about him and wrote page after page of corrections and complaints about his biographers. So I'm kind of glad that I'm doing this after 1974, because I don't think I really want to hear what he has to say. But here's one of his corrections to one biographer. I have no feeling of bitterness about the fact that I never completed a full academic year before I entered college. All in all, I would not trade the resulting difficulties I encountered for the qualities I gained. I would not say that I had no use for learning for its own sake, but I still do not have overly much. I liked my learning to relate to my interests and to life. So a couple of lessons maybe from that. Number one is one that Christians should understand, that nothing is wasted, right? God has a remarkable ability to work through lots of circumstances. People have a remarkable ability to make meaning out of lots of challenges, and failure itself is educational. I think we all know that as well. And so nothing is wasted, even if it feels like a struggle at some point. It is interesting, though, you've now heard twice, both from Charles and his mother, saying what mattered to education was interest. Passion dictated learning, right? And there was no connection made in his high school and his college. There was no connection to his real passion, which is flying. So he leaves Madison, he goes to Nebraska in 1922, enrolls in flight school. And by 1924, he's training to be an Army flyer. And 3 years after that is when he flies as a male pilot, was the job at the time, to Paris. He writes 3 years later, in 1927, I was well satisfied by the progress of my flying career and little concerned by questions of education. We have a lot of people here who are here to do vocational training. They're not here to study aviation. They have to go to University of North Dakota, I think, to do that. But we do have a lot of people who want a kind of technical skill that leads to a certain kind of career, right? And as a humanities professor, my instinct is to push back against that, right? And say, well, that's just a transactional view of education. Or as I blogged this morning for the Anxious Bench, that's an instrumental view of education. That's not what I want. But that's why they're here. And maybe it's actually a genuine passion. And maybe I should not just assume that they're making some sort of deal with the market. Maybe they actually really do want to be an accountant like Bruce. Right? Like maybe that's actually a passion of theirs. And I'm just a very small part of their education in that sense. At the same time, I don't want them to be little concerned by questions of education. That's not what we're doing here. If it is instrumental, if it is transactional, if it is professional or vocational, it's still a liberal arts education, right? And I hope our students are cultivating something else. And that did happen for Charles Lindbergh, but later and mostly by his own direction. So here's our second vignette. Imagine that it's 1932. We'll even make it Bethel. Bethel was a junior college as of 1931. So imagine you're a biology professor at Bethel Junior College in 1932. You go to your post office box and you pull out the new issue of Science magazine, Science Journal, the leading periodical for the natural sciences. And you flip through the pages, and all of a sudden you see an unexpected name. Charles Lindbergh wrote a 2-page article on washing corpuscles, essentially technical advice for how to do experiments involving blood cells. And then 3 years later, he published another article in the same journal on something called a perfusion pump, which is an important device along the way to the development of open heart surgery and transplant surgery. So what's going on here? How did someone who flunked out of UW-Madison, never got within earshot of any degree whatsoever, get published in a peer-reviewed journal like Science? In 1930, a year into his marriage, Charles Lindbergh's sister-in-law developed a severe heart condition. And Lindbergh was just astonished and infuriated that there was really nothing that could be done. And heart surgery was not developed far and long enough to that point, and he thought, I need to do something. And he managed to get connected with a guy at the Rockefeller Institute in New York named Alexis Carrel, a Nobel laureate surgeon and scientific researcher from France. Carrel was educated by the Jesuits, and as we'll see in a second, becomes an important religious influence on Lindbergh, but he is a world-renowned scientist, and he realized that Charles Lindbergh, although poorly educated, had a brilliant mechanical mind, and they worked together to develop these techniques and devices that enhanced Carrel's biological research, and was generous enough to co-publish articles with Lindbergh in Science. Many years later, the year before he died, Lindbergh was invited to Georgetown University, which is where Carrel's papers wound up, because there was a Jesuit historian there who wrote a biography of Carrel. And Lindbergh, a year before he died, was really struck this was an appropriate place, this Jesuit university, to remember Alexis Carrel. Here's what he said. I'm glad to have the opportunity of talking to you about my old friend Alexis Carrel. Georgetown offers an appropriate setting for the observance of the centenary of his birth. Here in this Jesuit community, the educational, the scientific, and the spiritual meet as they met in him throughout his life. You know, one obvious lesson for that is here in this pietist community, the educational, the scientific, and the spiritual meet. There's something that Carrel embodies that I think is what we're striving for. This is not just a place for scientific research. This is not just a religious community. This is not just a liberal arts college. It's all of those things, right? The spiritual, research, reading of great books, that's all part of what we do here as at Georgetown. And that is kind of Carrel's, what he's best known for in the end, plus one other thing I won't mention quite yet. He's a great surgeon, but by the 1930s, Carrel is a best-selling author who's calling for a different view of science, one that is not limited to natural and mechanical explanations, that is looking to understand humanity, including the spiritual side of humanity and the metaphysical side of the world. That's the proper ambit of science, and it needs to go beyond the scientific revolution. He yearns for the days when medieval mystics were people of knowledge. That's his view of science. And this is what Lindbergh absorbs. And by 1935, Lindbergh is writing that while he was still interested in science, it didn't go far enough. His questions were now not about things like heart surgery, biological research. They're about what happens after death. Is the natural and the visible all that is? In Lindbergh, influenced by Carrel and influenced by his wife, we'll mention in a second, essentially creates his own gen ed curriculum for himself. He starts, while he's in Europe, he takes that time in privacy and quiet. He reads Plato for the first time. He reads Shakespeare for the first time. He reads Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. He doesn't like them, but he reads them. Charles Lindbergh is a classical American character, one that's always kind of a challenge to people like us. Charles Lindbergh is an autodidact. He's a self-taught man. Like Frederick Douglass and many other people beside him, he didn't have formal schooling, but he was intelligent and he taught himself. And so I always take this as a bit of a challenge. You know, I think of Good Will Hunting, right? Subscription, you know, like overdue fees at the Boston Public Library versus Harvard tuition, right? That kind of attitude. But I think we can learn things from this. First of all, there is something powerful about curiosity. And our job is not just not to stifle it, but to encourage it. And Lindbergh himself says this in his posthumous autobiography. My mind, often wandering without conscious direction, began reconsidering childhood questions about life and death. What he means is he kept flying after the flight to Paris. He even helped build TWA and consulted Pan Am, right? He's a founding father of modern aviation, but he got bored. And all those hours aloft, his mind would start flitting back to those questions that church couldn't answer for him. Who is God? Is this all there is to life? What happens after death? And that led him to science, but then it led him to other kinds of things like philosophy and literature and art. And that became part of his education because he followed his curiosity. So I think it's a good challenge that we're all, again, pretty familiar with, but can be reminded of in September at the start of the new year. Right? Our job is not just to fill up empty buckets, right, with information. Our job is to kindle a fire and to fan it. You know, how do we do this for our students in whatever class we're teaching? How do we help them to catch that spark of curiosity and to follow it themselves? And there's a role for us here. The other thing that does stand out to me is I've called him as autodidact, right? Self-taught. And there's a very solitary aspect to much of Lindbergh's life, but there are important relationships in his life. Carrel, right, is one who's helping this. But the other person who's really important is his wife, Anne, who goes to Smith College. She's got a liberal arts education. In fact, her mom became president of Smith at the beginning of World War II. And she is fully taught in all these things, and she helps guide her husband. When Spirit of St. Louis comes out and wins the Pulitzer, there's speculation that Anne Lindbergh, who's already a best-selling, bookseller award-winning author, had actually ghostwritten it. And she told people, I didn't do it. And then privately, she wrote this in a letter. I didn't do this, but 20 years of living with me, slowly changing and opening, sharpening his perceptions, his articulateness, his aesthetic and spiritual sensitivities did do this. At this point, she's kind of overcome her early infatuation with her husband and seeing him more critically and able to realize she has actually been his teacher in a sense this whole time. And this is an old idea. We just read this in Aristotle in CWC. Where do the virtues come from? Where does knowledge come from? And Aristotle writes about the importance of teachers, but he also writes about the importance of other relationships. Who are your friends? Who are the people you love best in the world? They shape who you become as well. And so that's a challenge to us because we're not just solitary learners, we're part of a community. And so even if it might not seem like you're doing much for your students, this is why Edgren said that the relationship is one of friend and helper, right? Not master and servant. Friendship is actually a powerful conduit to learning. And that's something we ought to try to cultivate with at least a few of our students. I don't imagine we can do this with all 140 kids sitting in CC 313, but maybe with one or two, right? You know, we call this mentoring, but I think it's actually something deeper than that. All right, last vignette. In 1948, 5 years before he wrote Spirit of St. Louis, Charles Lindbergh ventured out from his kind of World War II ostracism to publish a weird little book called A Flight in Life. It's barely 60 pages in hardcover. And it's the first kind of glimpse people had of his spiritual journey. He quotes Jesus, he quotes Lao Tzu, he talks about Hinduism and Jewish scripture, and he basically, his argument is that while the West needs science and technology, it needs something more than that. He had flown over Hiroshima. He had visited Germany after the bombing campaign. He was horrified by what World War II had done to the civilized world, as he described it. And so his argument here is that we need the wisdom and the ethical insight and restraint of the world's religions. And not just Christianity, but foremost, really he, in a sense, feels like he is a student of Jesus as an ethical teacher, if nothing else. And that's A Flight in Life. So I want you to imagine that you're the president of the University of Chicago in 1948. If you know anything about that institution, it means you're an interesting person named Robert M. Hutchins, who's famous for a number of things. He takes the University of Chicago out of the Big Ten, so he's a hero to many academics for that. His faculty is not enamored of him. He tries to reform the curriculum. They vote him down 3 times. By the late 1940s, though, he's helped establish the Great Books curriculum. He is a generalist, right? He believes that this is not just about acquiring vocational training or information, it's about cultivating certain kinds of whole persons, which we can find congenial. So he gets a complimentary copy of this book and writes back a letter to Lindbergh that starts very complimentarily. You have correctly stated, the aim of education is the wisdom of living and not the absorption of information. But then he goes on, and halfway through the letter, he has a critique of Lindbergh. And it's not that Lindbergh is too harsh on science, although some of his professors were really upset. There's a physicist named Walter Bartke that Lindbergh got to know because he did nuclear research at the University of Chicago, who was really offended because Lindbergh talks about science becoming its own kind of idolatry and religion, and Bartke hated that. Hutchins didn't mention that, he mentioned something else. But here's what he said to Lindbergh. I venture to think that you oversimplify the doctrine of equality in your attack on it. It is very hard for me to accept any theory that implies that some nations or some races are better than others. And that's also part of A Flight in Life. Lindbergh is very concerned that other parts of the world are going to have too many children and overwhelm what he calls Western civilization. And Lindbergh argues that equality is not something to be desired. Instead, we should be enhancing the quality of life of the best among us. And here we should start to hear overtones of another big influence mediated via Alexis Carrel, which is eugenics and white supremacy. Carrel's best-selling book argues for that. He wants to use this enhanced, broader sense of science in order to protect the white race, in order to pull out the best of his civilization to protect it from the onslaught of other races. This is Charles Lindbergh's mentor. This is who he's celebrating at Georgetown in 1973. And this is no isolated case. This is a modest statement in Lindbergh's terms. Go back 10 years. So Lindbergh is living in France, the coast of Brittany at this point, a little island called Iliac, and he sits down to write an appeal to what he calls the minority of the world, to an elite that he wants to speak to. And he writes this: of all the gods, idols set up by man, none is more false than the God of equality. Men are not equal and should have no desire to be equal. The richness of life lies in its differences and not in its similarities. A world of equal people would be like a desert of sand. Now, this will get more horrifying as we go, but like pause to understand like how far this is away from the 1920 Lindbergh, right? Like this is someone who comes to conclusions I find troubling, but is grappling with big ideas, right? And is trying to articulate, he's reaching for something, and he is all of a sudden interested in the divine, however he defines it. The doctrine of equality, though, is a doctrine of death. There is no equality in nature, in beauty, or in life. It is a concept of man and not of God. Now, if Charles Lindbergh were to suddenly sidle up next to me, right, he would say, Gehrz, you misunderstand. I just don't want sameness, right? I want us all to be exactly the same, right? He would probably claim, I believe in diversity. He'd want to claim that sort of buzzword that's common on campuses like this. You might want to believe just on that, give him benefit of the doubt, saying that's what he really believes, right? But Charles Lindbergh, if nothing else, believes in the essentialism of different races. You have to start there. He does not want to see mixed marriages, for example. Even in his posthumous autobiography, he warns against the mixing of races. And even in this letter, written in 1938, as war clouds gather over Europe, as Hitler is about to try to annex part of Czechoslovakia, Hitler then continues straight into this paragraph. Shall we submerge the spirit and life of Europe in the yellow of Asia, or the black of Africa? Or shall we stand with the Athenians at Marathon, unmindful of opposing numbers? Equal rights exist only among equal people, equal by their own nature, and not because they simply look similar to other men. Marathon's interesting allusion here. So the early 5th century BC, the warrior citizens of Athens, 10,000 strong, gather at Marathon in order to fend off an attack by at least 3 times as many Persians, right? And miraculously win, and they send the runner back. That's where the marathon comes from. This is a not so veiled allusion to the notion that Europe is threatened by hordes from the east, right? Athens is threatened by Persia. Europe is being threatened by who in 1938? Not Hitler. That's not the Eastern War. Those aren't the Persians. He means the Soviets, the godless communists. He calls them the Asiatics. And he means the Chinese and the Japanese. That's who he's talking about. That's the allusion he's making. Later that same year, Lindbergh pays his 3rd visit in 3 years to Nazi Germany. I mean, it started with him just observing the Luftwaffe. And in 1938, he goes to a public dinner with Hermann Goering, who takes out a swastika emblazoned medal and pins it on Lindbergh. And Lindbergh writes him a thank you note. And all of a sudden, press attention starts to change about Charles Lindbergh. This is never published, right? Most people never hear this. But in 1939, in November, when he comes back to start arguing against the US getting involved in this new war that broke out in September, Lindbergh writes a piece for Reader's Digest called Aviation, Race, and Geography. And the most infamous part of that, he says, here's the main reason the US should not get involved in this war. We shouldn't be fighting this war. This is a war within the family of nations of Europe. What we should be doing, he tells Reader's Digest readers in 1939, is building a Western wall of arms and race. English, French, Americans, and Germans standing up to the Asiatic threat. That's not private at all. That's very public. So that's the context for 2 years later when Lindbergh makes his Des Moines speech about the Jews. That's only part of the picture, right? In 1940, privately, he comes home from voting the presidential election, his dinner with Carell and Ann, a bunch of friends, says the first thing we have to do to protect America is take away the vote from the Black people. This is part of Lindbergh, at least in this time period too, and there's very little evidence he ever gave up essentially this vision, that the world is a world of racial competition. Inequality is not something to be valued. So back to my introduction to the book. It's a harsh way to start a book, but I think this is what struck me. Here is the spiritual but not religious story of Lindbergh that I came to understand. It leads to this view of human equality and this view of racial competition and white supremacy. Lindbergh drew from Christian beliefs and practices as they suited him, but in a piecemeal fashion that left unchallenged some of his cruelest convictions. Most strikingly, Charles Lindbergh spilled much ink on the purpose and dimensions of human existence, but never seems to have taken seriously the biblical claim that all humans are made in the image of God. On the contrary, he concluded that equality, as you've read, was a false idol, the concept of man and not God, and persisted for years in defining what he called the quality of life in terms that borrowed heavily from eugenics. The free-thinking aviator may have seen himself, as he wrote one time, as one of those who believe in God and who search honestly for his way, but he discovered a deity whose laws happened to coincide with his own belief in the necessity of racial competition. And Lindbergh's insistence on flying solo in this, not just across the Atlantic, meant that no external authority would contest or complicate his inner convictions. Lindbergh avoids organized religion, not just because he finds it superstitious or hypocritical, he doesn't want a religious authority to challenge these views, whether it be the Bible, a theological tradition, a priest, a magisterial authority. He wants to believe as he's going to believe, and he makes God in his own image. And so doesn't see the image of God in other people. So to sum up, 3 educational lessons from Charles Lindbergh. 2 I've mentioned, the one that I want to pull out of this darkest chapter of the Lindbergh story. Number 1, our students need us to notice them, right? We need to see beyond what they expect of college, what they present of themselves, and sometimes point towards, you can see that person flying across the ocean who doesn't seem to be sitting in an English classroom in 1920. We need to see Tara Westover for more than what she sees of herself. We need to stimulate and guide their curiosity. For many of our students, these are their last years of structured education where they've got people with some authority over them, trying to guide them. This is where it's most important to help create them to be autodidacts the rest of their life, right? I don't know if it's just COVID or what's happened, but for some reason, the last year and a half, I've been thinking over and over about this syllabus boilerplate. You should expect 2 to 3 hours of study for every hour spent in class. And it struck me more clearly than ever before, that's actually what matters. It's not the hour I control them in class or influence them in class. It's what's happening beyond my sight. That's actually what matters, because that's the best predictor of the kind of learner and student they're going to be the rest of their life. I can do things to shape that and stimulate that and structure it to some extent, or incentivize it or penalize it, right? But mostly that's shifting to them. And especially by the time I've got like my applied humanities seminar students last night, I'm not the expert. I'm maybe a facilitator at best. They're the ones who are going to be teaching me on Monday nights this semester, and then teaching themselves the rest of their life. And I think those are valuable lessons, but understand, this led Lindbergh to eugenics and anti-Semitism and white supremacy. Right? He was noticed, not in school, but by Carell and by his wife. When she first met him at dinner in Mexico City, was amazed to hear this quiet pilot talking about Chinese civilization with her sister. Like, she saw something in him and they nurtured it and guided it, and Carell did the same. And that's what wound up with someone who thought that equality was a doctrine of death, a human idol, not a thing of God. Now, I don't know if that's happening with our students. I don't know. But I do think this is the hardest part of what we need to do for them. In some way, we do need to contest and complicate their beliefs. This is a loaded thing to say at this kind of place, right? Charles Lindbergh would find Bethel pure dogmatism. He would never accept the idea that the faculty have agreed to theological beliefs, right? That would be foreign to him. And I'm not saying we challenge all beliefs. But I do think if they're actually here to search honestly for God's way in Lindbergh's, we've got to push them there. Otherwise, they're very likely to find a God who looks just like them. That's a very human tendency, to make idols, to anthropomorphize God, and it looks just like us. So how do we contest, or at least how do we complicate their beliefs about God? And specifically in this season, right? I was writing this in the midst of the George Floyd riots, right? About someone who wanted to take votes away from Black people and thought there should be a Western wall of arms against the yellow and brown peoples of the world. If they are honestly searching for God, we need to help them then see God's image in all people, not just the ones who come from their class, come from their background, share their religion, share their politics, right? But in all people. And that's, I think, a challenge all of us have in our different fields. Because otherwise, someone's going to be up here telling a different story about a Bethel student who comes to a conclusion like Lindbergh's, and I don't want to see that happen years from now. Okay, I think I've left like 2 minutes for questions, which is a good educational strategy from someone who probably has said all that they know to say about a topic, but we do have 2 minutes, so we have time. Yeah.
Thanks for a great talk, Chris. This was fantastic. So I'm trying to make sense of this tension, right? So he has this, rah-rah Western civilization, like all that rhetoric and that deep thinking, that racism. At the same time, he's traveling the world, learning about world religions and embracing them to some extent and trying to, he's imbibing them, trying to make them a part of his life, engaging with people of different cultures. How do you make sense of that?
I don't. No, I'm glad you picked up on that because, especially, I think there might be a slight turn the last years of his life. He really does think there's something superior about what he kind of certainly calls primitive civilizations. He thinks there's closer to the earth, right? They're more simplified. They're not as tempted by technology. But yeah, it is interesting that he is so drawn then, having said all these denigrating things about non-white peoples, he is interested, especially in Eastern religions. When he's in Paris in 1938 and 39, he befriends a guy named Lin Yutang, who was born to a Christian pastor in China, became a Confucian. Then by the time Lindbergh met him, he converted back to Christianity. He was very interested in this guy. He also kept him at arm's length, right? Like, and this happens with anti-Semitism too. Lindbergh's protest was always, but I have Jewish friends, right? Abraham Flexner, for example. Harry Guggenheim, great aviation industrialist, right? That was Lindbergh's. And I think the way to think about this is I'm not sure that Lindbergh evinces personal prejudice all that often. In one of the really moving passages I found, his daughter remembers reading this Des Moines talk and saying, that doesn't fit. Who is this? This wasn't my father was a tolerant, progressive person for the 1950s. I think there are ways to put this together. Like, it is perfectly possible not to live out of bias and prejudice, to form relationship with people, but then to have category mistakes about entire classes of people, right? There's a difference between personal racism and structural or systemic racism. Like, you can personally not feel biased towards individuals and yet still subscribe to a worldview that condemns that group of people to second-class status, right, or to subservience of some sort. So that's the best way I can do it, but I think it is a tension. I don't think he really resolved, and I'm not sure that I resolved in the book. Okay, that was a good question. Go on. It's about 12:05. I have class in 10 minutes. So thank you for your attention and your interest. Hopefully this was a good challenge for the beginning of the year.